Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Shore, and I am the Director of Clinical Affairs and Advocacy here at CurePSP. It is always a pleasure to moderate our Ask the Expert webinar series. Our topic today is the ins and outs of research for progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, corticobasal degeneration, or CBD, and multiple system atrophy, or MSA. A few notes before we get started. This program will be about an hour long. We are recording this webinar live, but it will be archived on Facebook and on our YouTube channel later on for you or anybody else to view. A copy of our speakers' slides and the link to the recording will be emailed to those who had pre-registered. So if that is you, be on the lookout for that after. And our speaker will likely address many of your questions throughout her presentation. And very realistically, we're not able to get to everybody's questions, especially because this is a particularly loaded topic today. But that being said, you are welcome to type your questions into the comment box or comment section of the platform that you are using to view this live. We are also going to be referring to many of the questions that you all submitted when you pre-registered. Please note that information shared in this webinar is not meant to be medical advice. We recommend not sharing personal health information in the comments, and we always encourage you to talk to your healthcare team if you have specific and personal medical questions and concerns. Also, if you're viewing this live, if you want to use the comment section to say hi and share where you're tuning in from today. That's always fun for us to see how people are watching this from all over the country and beyond. So with that, I would love to bring Dr. Brummet up on the screen with me. She'll have to unmute. There you go. Hey, Dr. Brummet. So research in all of its forms is, of course, goes without saying, is key to understanding neurodegenerative diseases, improving diagnosis and treatments, and ultimately leading to cures. But we often receive questions from our community members about the different kinds of research that's being conducted, how to get involved, and many other questions around the complexities of that. And I thought, who to better address this than one of our very own team members, Dr. Jennifer Brummet. Dr. Brummet is our Associate Director of Scientific Affairs and Partnerships here at CurePSP. She has her PhD in Behavioral Neuroscience, and before joining our team earlier this year, she was the research manager at the American Epilepsy Society. At CurePSP, she oversees our research grant programs, our scientific symposium, and several key partnerships and other initiatives pertinent to the Cure pillar of CurePSP's main pillars under our mission of care, consciousness, and cure. So welcome. It is so much fun to be working with you in this way, and thank you for being here and talking about this really important topic. I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so happy to be here talking a little bit about the research process that goes into learning more about neurodegenerative diseases. Like Jessica said, I work on the CurePSP team as our Associate Director of Scientific Affairs and Partnerships. So I look forward to talking about research with you today. When Jessica and I were going through what we might want to cover today, there was really so many different directions this could go. So where we settled in on focusing for our time together today is really kind of a research 101 lesson going through the very basics of what scientific research is, some research terminology that gets used a lot when talking about research results, and the research process. Towards the end, I also want to talk a little bit about a patient-focused approach. How can our community stay engaged and informed, and a discussion of some of the priority research areas in the field. And I'll end with just a few quick highlights of recent findings that are relevant to PSP, CBD, and MSA. So we'll talk about those items today. It'll be a quick 30 minutes. I think a lot of these topics could be a 30 to 60-minute topic on their own. So it will be definitely a high-level overview, but hopefully this is just the first part of a conversation, and that we can schedule some future sessions to dig in more to some of these topics. I want to start with the very basics about what research really is. Research is a term that can conjure up a lot of different ideas for people. So I wanted to start with the very basics of what we mean when we're talking about scientific research or biomedical research that's being done in neurodegenerative diseases. So there's a whole process and an approach that goes in to studying scientific questions. And it really starts with a question or a problem that needs to be solved. So there will be researchers that are asking questions about a particular topic for our interest today related to neurodegenerative diseases or to PSP, CBD, or MSA specifically. And then they'll try to come up with a hypothesis that they can test about this question to try to answer it. And a hypothesis is something that can be tested and proven or disproven wrong based on the experiments that they will then conclude. So, an example from PSP or CBD, there might be a question about what does the tau protein that's implicated in these diseases look like? And their hypothesis might be that someone with PSP has a form of a tau protein that looks different than people without PSP. And then they'll move on to design an experiment to test this question and try to learn more about that and collect data on it that they will then analyze and try to draw some conclusions from the data. So that's kind of the crux of the research team actually going through and testing these questions. They will have a question, they design an experiment that seeks to answer it, they get data, and then they analyze it and try to draw some meaningful conclusions about that question from it. And then the key part is also that the research team needs to report these findings. If an exciting finding happens in a laboratory and it's never shared outside of that laboratory, it really won't make an impact. So sharing findings with other researchers or clinicians and the public community is really key to the scientific research process. And often the answer to one question generates a lot more questions. So one finding will just lead to often more experiments being done, sometimes by the same research team, often by other research teams. So in summary, scientific research is really problem-driven, hypothesis-driven. It's done in a controlled fashion, it's data-driven, and it's as objective and unbiased as possible. And this graphic here is just summarizing what I just said in a different way. This is a helpful infographic from the National Institutes of Health, which is the US government agency that does a lot of biomedical research that walks through what I was just talking about. This is really the key of the research process. There are a lot of questions out there, and research teams are trying to answer them as best they can using a variety of different angles and approaches and techniques. They build evidence up. And again, you'll see on the upper right there, the key is really sharing this data. And that will allow researchers and experts in the field and in the community to really start to draw some big picture conclusions and form some next steps in terms of what needs to be asked and done next to keep the field moving forward. And so now that we've talked at a high level about what scientific research is, I want to dive into some buckets that research often gets categorized into. And there's three main buckets of research that people typically refer to, and that is basic, translational, and clinical research. And basic research is really a curiosity-driven, fundamental knowledge-driven approach to research. These are often done in laboratories, using animal models, using cell cultures, very, very laboratory-driven methods that are there to just learn more about the underlying biology or underlying questions related to something. And so an example for PSP or CBD or MSA might be studying the tau protein to learn more about its structure, or identifying a potential gene that might be implicated in something. The next type of research is translational research, which is kind of this, it's bridging the gap between basic research, which we just talked about, and clinical research, which we'll talk about next. And translational research tries to take basic research and apply it to hopefully move towards the clinical research end of the spectrum. And translational research really encompasses a lot of different types of models and techniques. It might be done in animal models. It might be done it might be done still in a laboratory. It might be trying to learn more about a brain imaging methodology. It's really a wide range of topics that are covered underneath this bucket. And so an example here might be testing a potential drug or compound that targets a certain protein or gene to see if it has an impact in animal models. And if that's promising, that result might be able to move on to the clinical research stage. And so for clinical research, this is studies done in humans, and they might be directly with people. It might be studies using samples that were obtained from people, or electronic health records, or things like that. But clinical research is really trying to study things in humans with the goal of improving symptoms or clinical outcomes in some way. So an example here might be a clinical trial, which is something I'm sure many people are familiar with, testing a drug in humans to see if it's safe or effective. Or it might be testing patient blood samples to see how protein levels look in different people, and perhaps see how they correlate to other facets of the person's symptoms. Or it might be using electronic health records to dig through and understand a little bit more about the diagnostic journey that patients have went through. So these are really the three main types of research out there. There's a lot of gray area and overlap between these three for sure. So these aren't always black and white, but these are terms that get used a lot in the research field. So I wanted to make sure we talked about them a little bit. And you might have also heard the term the research pipeline. And so when people say that, what they are often referring to is things that are kind of moving through these different stages of research. Of course, everyone wants every finding to make it out of that translational stage into something that can be put into a clinical context. And so that's kind of what people are referring to when they talk about the research pipeline. But realistically, this isn't always a linear, stepwise process. Sometimes basic research findings might not make it any further in the research pipeline. Sometimes things make it to the translational stage, but then don't work out in clinical trials. Sometimes clinical trials have unexpected results that might lead researchers to go back to the basic research stage to understand a little bit more about what might have happened. And all three of these types of research are just really important to making sure that research is moving forward. So it's a nonlinear process, and it's just really important for the field to have a really healthy amount of work going into as many of these different types of research as we can at any given time. And I wanted to just share some high-level examples of research that fits into these categories as it relates to PSP and CBD and MSA. And I won't dig into any one of these in particular at the moment, but at the top of the slide, you'll see some that are more towards the basic research spectrum, and it moves down towards the clinical spectrum as we approach the bottom of the slide. So at the top, you can see some very, very basic studies that are just seeking to learn a little bit more about neuroinflammation, the tau protein, how it's folding and how it relates to corticobasal degeneration. In the middle of the slide, you'll see some studies looking more at how tau seeds from patients induce PSP symptoms in primates, right? So that's a very translational study that's building on a basic science finding and trying to understand how it might apply to a clinical research study in the future. And then at the bottom, you can see some more clinical research examples where researchers tested a drug for safety and efficacy, or where they're trying to understand more about the clinical neuroimaging features of diseases that will improve diagnosis in humans. And so now that we've talked a little bit about the different types of research and how an individual study might work or might be categorized, I also just want to talk a little bit about how research progresses or moves forward. And one key concept to the scientific research community is reproducibility. And this means that a study that finds an exciting result can be reproduced by other research teams. And that leads to consensus building about conclusions that can be drawn. And this is really the key to moving research forward, because it means it's a strong and robust finding that can be widely replicated in a variety of settings. And that just sets the research finding up for success in the future as it continues to move on to other laboratories or other stages of the research finding. And this doesn't mean that one study can't be exciting on its own. It just means that in order to really propel research forward, that one exciting finding will then probably move into several research teams or other studies within the same research team to be replicated and built upon to confirm that the finding is what they thought it was, and that it can move forward in a robust and strong way. And as we've already discussed, but I just want to re-emphasize, sharing results is so important. And this can be challenging for researchers for sure. There can be a lag time and some obstacles to getting results out there in a timely manner, but it's really critical to share the findings that come out of research studies. This allows other research teams to stay up to date on what other research teams have found and build on that in their own research lab. And for the scientific community themselves, this often happens through a couple of avenues. And one is going to scientific conferences and sharing results there. And the other is publishing in peer-reviewed journals, which is the goal for most research outcomes, is to be published in a journal. And as we've already talked about, again, the research pipeline is not always linear, but that's okay. I think some exciting findings come out of things that happen in unexpected ways. So there are a lot of findings that move from basic to translational to clinical in a stepwise fashion, but often there are basic science findings from other fields that might get picked up and moved along the pipeline. There might be findings from clinical research studies in certain fields that lead to an exciting result that can be applied elsewhere. So these can help move research progress forward as well. And then last, I do just want to highlight too that research can really work on a slow timeline at times. And I'm not saying this to be pessimistic, I'm just sharing this to be realistic. There are a lot of factors that go into research studies that can really take a long time. So for clinical trials, dosing a patient multiple times over a few years and testing results, that's how long the study takes, right? You won't have any results to share until that study moves through its few-year trajectory. Or for labs working with animal models, it can really take a long time to get the animal model up and running as expected and complete the experiment in a timely manner. And so, some experiments move quicker than others, but in general, this is why it's just so important to have a healthy amount of research happening in basic and translational and clinical at any given time. It just helps ensure that there's always something moving forward, even if there are some studies operating on a slow timeline. So next, and this is definitely one of the topics I referred to that could be a talk in and of itself. I just wanted to talk a little bit about who's actually doing the research and where the money is coming from for this. And so in the United States, a lot of research is done at university settings. with some also being done in hospitals and in private industry companies. And again, in the US, basic science is highly concentrated in university laboratories. And this is because this is just an academic setting that's not necessarily profit driven in the same way that some other research settings are. So this is a productive environment for people asking these fundamental questions, to have the support to pursue these critical lines of research, to learn more about the underlying biology. And if you look into any research related material online, one term you might come across on a regular basis is PI, or principal investigator. And these are the leads of the research teams conducting research. So they're often PhDs or MDs or MD PhDs or other professional degrees that have their own laboratory and are pursuing a line of research professionally. And they often have a laboratory of people that are supporting their research projects and working on these questions with them. So in biomedical science, that often includes PhD students or people who recently got a PhD that are completing a postdoctoral fellowship, medical fellows, and other trained research professionals that help them manage their animal colonies or help them process brain tissue or other specialized skills. And so, much like any other endeavor, research needs money to happen. And so in the academic setting in particular, grants are one of the core mechanisms for how researchers get funding. PIs of laboratories spend a lot of time applying to grants in order to support their research efforts. It's really the key way that a lot of this research is moving forward in the university setting. And in the United States, the federal government agency, the National Institutes of Health, is the largest biomedical research funder in the country. So this is where a lot of academic PIs are applying to in order to get their research support. And it really does take a lot of time. They're lengthy applications that researchers spend a lot of time putting together to get support for their lab, and they'll apply with a specific question and experiment in mind at the time of application. And one note in particular about NIH, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide, is that they really can drive research agendas and priorities. And so in the recent years, they've actually had a special Alzheimer's disease and related dementia initiative, which has been really great because it earmarks a set of funding that goes into studying Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, which includes PSP and CBD. And there's also lots of research going into MSA as well, which I'll highlight on the next slide. But, and thankfully, NIH is not the only funder of research in the US, though. There are a lot of other people supporting research, including nonprofits such as CurePSP and other government agencies. Nonprofits don't have quite as much money to support research with, but nonprofits play a really important role in supporting research in these areas because they can set their research agenda. So CurePSP funds research because we can put what is a relatively small amount of money towards research that fits our priorities. It helps ensure that researchers who need money to do studies on PSP or CBD can get support from us to hopefully help them collect some information and then go on to apply to a much larger grant from the NIH that will help move research forward. And in terms of other government agencies, across the research spectrum, the National Science Foundation funds a lot of basic biology studies. The FDA and the CDC fund different components of the research pipeline. So there's a lot of avenues out there for PIs to get support for this work, which is great. There's never enough, but there are a lot of people out there funding work in these fields. And just to highlight the biggest funder here, I went onto the NIH website, which is publicly accessible. It's called the NIH Reporter, and you can search for any projects that are currently being funded by them as an agency. So at least when I pulled this data a few weeks back, at that time, there was 97 active projects on PSP, 48 on CBD, and 83 on MSA. And you can see the dollar amounts to the right there. So 97 million on PSP, 47, and then 57 million for MSA. And just to clarify too, this is probably only capturing a subset of the research that's going into these fields. There are other studies that could be applicable that might not specifically list these diseases in their abstract and wouldn't have come up in my search. So again, it's never enough, but there is a lot of research going into PSP and CBD and MSA at the NIH level, which is great. And the chart at the bottom, which I know no one can read the axes for, which is fine, shows the investment into PSP by year. So hopefully what comes across in this graph is how much investment has gone up in recent years into these areas. And this is in part due to increased research focus on neurodegenerative diseases. And like I mentioned, NIH has some earmarked funding for this. And just to note, that line at the end is the current fiscal year. And I know it looks lower, but it's incomplete. That line will almost certainly go up as we head towards the end of the fiscal year. It's capturing an incomplete data point at this stage in the calendar year. And so with that, I wanted to turn a little bit more to the CurePSP community and how people on this call or people watching this recording can consider their own involvement in research and what they might be able to do if they want to learn more or get involved in some way. And we get a lot of questions about this from our community through email and other avenues. So I want to highlight some here. And again, like I've already said once, this is definitely something we could spend a whole hour talking about on its own. So this will be a very quick overview, and potentially we can get into some of this in the Q&A portion once we get there. But one thing that anyone can do is look up articles online. And this can be challenging sometimes because scientific articles can be a little bit hard to access. And they might be written in a way that's not very approachable for everyone to read. But you can go to Google Scholar and look up academic articles that are being published in the field. And I do just want to encourage everyone who does this to really know your sources. If you're searching on Google Scholar, you'll be getting high quality peer-reviewed scientific journals, which is important to feeling comfortable with the information that you're finding in your search. If you're interested in learning more about clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov is the federal government website in the United States that all trials happening in the US need to be registered with, and you can go on and search. I fully acknowledge that it is not the most user-friendly website at times, but thankfully there are some more user-friendly clinical trial finders out there. And one in particular I would recommend is the Michael J. Fox Trial Finder. It's a great resource. It's very user-friendly, and of note for attendees here, you can search specifically for trials that are on PSP, CBD, or MSA. And I would also encourage people on the line to keep an eye out for opportunities to provide a patient perspective and a patient voice. It's just really important to make sure that researchers are aware and that legislators are aware and really anyone is aware of what the needs of our community are, because it's just really key to making sure that the research taking place, is meaningful, and hoping that the patient input has been taken into consideration. And then also along those lines, I encourage people to consider what legislative advocacy activities they might feel comfortable with. As I've mentioned, the federal government is a huge driver of scientific funding and therefore can drive scientific priorities. And if you're on CurePSP's mailing list or you've attended past events with us, you might have seen that there are bills that we encourage our community to review and consider contacting your legislators to support them. It's really a key a key driver in helping to make sure that PSP and CBD and MSA are included as a priority research area in budget and in NIH considerations. And then last, one other consideration for our community is brain donation. This is a really impactful way to contribute to science and confirm diagnosis. And for the research component, brain donations are essential to moving research forward. These are just a key provider for research teams looking to learn more that will improve diagnosis and research in the future. And along those lines, I just want to quickly highlight a few identified priority research areas in these fields of research. First is improved diagnosis, and this is really key to helping move research forward. And along those lines, kind of in parallel, finding biomarkers is a key research area. And biomarkers are essentially something that a doctor or another clinician could test for in some way to confirm and measure progression. So an example of a biomarker we all probably get tested for if we go for a physical is your cholesterol level, right? That's something a doctor can use as a proxy to understand your heart health and continue to measure to understand if a medication they prescribed is working or confirm a diagnosis. And unfortunately, at this point, we just really don't have that for PSP or CBD or MSA in a clear way. So that's really a priority research area that people are working on. And then, we also just prioritize, we still need increased understanding of the basic biology of these diseases. Of course, drug development is a key research priority area, and hopefully that will come naturally as researchers continue to make progress on these other priority research questions. And then the last priority research area is that we also still just need to learn more about the patient journey and the diagnostic journey and make sure that we're understanding a wide range of people all around the planet and how they're getting diagnosed and experiencing symptoms. Really understanding what the person is going through is a key component that is also considered a research priority area for us. And then in the last few minutes here, before we go full into questions and answers, I just wanted to give really quick overviews of some recent findings in the field that I found exciting. And so this first one here got published in a journal late last year, so calendar year 2022. And the title is CSF tau microtubule binding region identifies pathological changes in primary tauopathies. The translation of what I found exciting about this, the findings of this study identified a form of the tau protein in blood samples, or in brain tissue samples, that was different in CBD patients than people with other primary tauopathies. And so this was an exciting finding because this is going after that biomarker I was referring to. This is potentially something if research teams can continue to refine and understand a little bit more about what this might mean, that could be something, if it continues to move through the research pipeline, would allow clinicians to have a way to test to confirm whether someone has CBD. And then this finding here, is the exciting finding that I'm sure most of you saw in the news earlier this calendar year about an alpha-synuclein assay that allows researchers to predict whether someone has Parkinson's or not. And so I know that this is not directly related to PSP or CBD or MSA at the moment, but this was really exciting because it was really successful. This is a test that can potentially be refined into something that clinicians can do in the future as part of diagnosing people with Parkinson's. And the research teams and the Michael J. Fox Foundation, who shepherded this finding, expressed a lot of excitement that it can be refined to help distinguish MSA from Parkinson's disease. And a few things that were particularly exciting about this, this was technology that was being used in another field of research to diagnose and understand more about other diseases. And it was able to be adapted for this purpose, which is great, right? Because it means that research doesn't have to start from square one. It means that something that had been used before was adapted, and that greatly cuts down the time it takes to research and come up with something. And then it's also really exciting because this can help improve future research studies. Accurate diagnoses are just absolutely critical to helping clinical trials maximize their potential for success. So tests like this can really help with the research process as well by helping sure that people are enrolling in the appropriate trials. And that will just really increase the quality of the trial itself and the output. And then the last slide I'll end on here is from a recent publication that was published by one of our partners at the Rainwater Charitable Foundation and some advisors that they work with, just doing a landscape analysis of all the different therapeutic options that are in the research pipeline in various stages that are out there. So this was not a study that they did, but this type of paper can really help synthesize different findings and summarize what they mean to the field. So this paper in particular just looked through the different therapeutic options that are out there in different phases. And this graph I have on the screen is just one of the figures they have in there that's giving an overview of different therapeutic options targeting tau and the type of therapeutic they are. So for example, monoclonal antibodies or gene therapy and things like that. So these are things that are in the pipeline, not quite to being an available treatment at the moment, but undergoing testing. So it's just exciting to see so many different options out there, and hopefully there will be even more in this chart in the years to come. So with that, I will pause for now and invite Jessica back, and hopefully we can have plenty of time for some questions and answers on the topics here. Thank you.
Hi again. Dr. Brummet, thank you so much. I mean, you did such a great job at breaking down a very big topic, especially with clarifying the three main buckets of research. And I also just want to say I particularly appreciated how you validated the frustration that we can hear from our community with how slow the process of moving research forward can be, but also reminded us of why that is, with how complex the research process is and everything that goes into that. Okay, so looking at some of the questions we got in the chat here, looking at some questions that we got when people pre-registered or emailed us, I guess along all these lines, I don't know. So here's a big question I want to ask you. Someone shared this, I think it was an email. What is it going to take to make brain diseases, especially the more rare brain diseases, a priority in research? For cancer, there is much more funding available and there is a plethora of medications to try, whereas for many neurodegenerative diseases, it is a challenge to find trial options for patients, and there are very limited options. And then a different person asked this sort of in a different way by sharing, how can we encourage institutions and drug companies to study these diseases more?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you to whoever submitted it, and thank you for asking it, Jessica. It's a great question, and I think I'll actually probably start with addressing the cancer component of it, because I think we all have a little bit to learn from what cancer as a community has really done. And I think if you go back several decades, cancer did not have the momentum it has today. And I think it really took a lot of work from a lot of different groups to get it to where it currently is now. So, I mean, it took patient voices, right? It really took people speaking up for the challenges they were facing and the needs of the community that was going through a cancer diagnosis. It took really focused funding, both from philanthropy and from the federal government, especially I hope I get my timeline right here, in the early 90s, I think was a huge momentum for cancer, with President Clinton making it a priority. There were different cancer nonprofits that really emerged at that time and got their voice out there. And, circling it back to our community, I think that's what it takes. And I think it takes a lot of dedicated patient momentum and community momentum. It takes a lot of focused nonprofit efforts, and really, it does take a lot of policy efforts as well. And I think that we've seen some movement on that in recent years, and not directly for PSP or CBD or MSA as much as we like. But if you look at the dedication going into Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, that was not always there. I mean, even as recently as 20 years ago to now, it's a night and day difference, right? And so I think just, a coordinated effort to really get voices amplified and state what needs to be done and help make that happen. That's the goal. We've seen it pay off for cancer. We've seen it pay off for Alzheimer's. We've seen it pay off for Parkinson's, and more work is needed in all of them. But hopefully, I think that gives our community some lessons learned on what we could consider priorities for us, to make them priorities for others. And in terms of getting people to study these diseases in their laboratories, this is why a lot of nonprofits have very targeted funding programs. A lot of PIs rely on grants to keep their research portfolio moving forward. And so a lot of nonprofits, including us at CurePSP, our stated goal of our grant program is to support early career researchers with the explicit goal to get them to work on areas that are important to us. And not only that, we don't want them working on it for 2 years, right? We want them working on it for a few years and then dedicating their research career to these lines of investigation. So I hope I answered all the different components of that question, which I really liked. If I didn't, I'm happy to answer a follow-up question.
No, yeah. I mean, in that, I'm hearing the importance of funding, the importance of advocacy and awareness from patient groups and from the community members alike, and from clinicians and researchers as well. And I'm also hearing a lot of hope in that. We don't have 20 years, right, to first get to where the past 20 years has gotten us with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, because people are living with these diseases now. But the fact that these other disease areas have progressed as they have in the past couple of decades it's very promising for us in terms of where we're going with our diseases.
Absolutely.
This is not a specific question that we got, but something you and I had talked a little bit about offline, and then some people kind of talked around this in a way in their questions. But can you speak to the need to improve the disconnect that sometimes is happening between patients and families who are living with the diseases and their lived experience, and also their needs as far as research goes, and the people doing the research and funding the research?
Yeah. And I touched on it really quickly, right, but didn't do it justice. The patient voice and experience is really so important for all of this, right? Because I think it's really easy for everyone to operate in their own silo, but without that ongoing conversation and understanding of the needs and realities on both sides, we'll be limited in how far we can go. So I do think that really being able to bridge that disconnect is critical. And I think there are some nonprofits out there that work on this at a high level, right? I think the National Organization of Rare Diseases does a lot of great work on this. There's a rare disease legislative advocacy group and a lot of resources out there that really aim to fix this. And I mean, and unfortunately, they're not easy solutions, right? But I do think there are opportunities for our community to, get involved through those organizations I just stated. And I think, too, it's really important for researchers to understand what patient research priorities really are, right? And help that guide their directions in terms of what they're seeking to study and learn. There's a lot of research going on across the research pipeline, like I mentioned, right? But I think at the core, it's just so key that everyone remembers that really at the end of the day, research is there to help people. So it's just it's key to address that. And I think one big challenge in that is it's really hard to get accessible scientific information out of research labs into the hands of people who want to learn about it. It's a huge challenge, not just for our community. This is a very, very systemic issue that people are trying to find ways to address. But I'm sure some people on this call have tried to look up a research article before, only to be hit with, oh, you have to pay $100 to download this PDF, or you need to log in through a university. And, that's a challenge. That's really just a blockade in terms of getting these results into the hands of people who want to learn about them. And even if you can access the article, sometimes it's written in a way that's not digestible to people without a science background, sometimes not even digestible to people with a science background in a different field. They're really written often in a very technical way. So yeah, it's a huge challenge. And, I think this is where I hope people turn to us as a resource too. If people come across something that they have a question on in that regard, Jessica and her team and me and others at CurePSP will do our best to try to connect people with the information or the resources that might be helpful.
That's actually a question I was going to ask you. So you touched on it, but maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit, because it was a question that we had received during registration, is how do research results make it to patients, clinicians, and the community? And also, in your eyes with that, what are some challenges and opportunities related to helping our community understand the research process and results? And by the way, I just want to add a quick thought with that how do we do that in a way that it's helpful and realistic for the community? Because what we tend to see is people find out about research results because it's picked up by media sometimes, and then it becomes kind of sensationalized and people get really excited and like, can I get this drug? And it's actually, a basic research finding. And so how do we disseminate information in an effective way?
Yeah, there's so many different parts of that question. I'm sure I'm going to forget to answer.
Sorry,
so I'll start and we'll circle back. No, it's all great information. So in terms of opportunities, I think this is where I really encourage everyone to just really, continue learning about what research is. I think people are their own best advocates and their own best source of being able to judge information, right? I think knowing more about the research process and the research pipeline will help put some of those sensationalized headlines into context, right? If you see a research finding that's getting a lot of media and then you read the summary of the article and it was something that was tested in mice, that's room for pause, right? That's something that in terms of the research pipeline is very far away from being a treatment that will be available to humans. Whereas if you read something about a promising phase 2 clinical trial, that's something that's potentially much more exciting, likely still being sensationalized a little bit in terms of its immediacy, but something that, is closer to relevant for our community. And in terms of how, going back to the start of your question, how research findings kind of make it out of labs and into the hands of others, a lot of times the first step is presenting at an academic conference. And those do get picked up by media outlets at times. And I will also shout out our longtime leader and board member and volunteer, Larry Golby. He has a great blog where if he goes to a scientific conference and he sees results that are relevant to PSP, he'll include brief summaries of those poster abstracts. And this is really the first step for most scientific results making it out of a laboratory setting. And this is kind of like a researcher to researcher avenue for sharing those findings and getting some feedback. The next step is typically publishing in a journal. And that can be a long a long process. I can't really sugarcoat it. Sometimes it takes years to publish research findings in journals, especially if it needs to be revised along the way. People are trying to chip away at that backlog by releasing papers publicly first. So there's some new resources out there to see stuff before they get published in a peer review journal, which is actually, it's great. It makes the information accessible much earlier. My one footnote there is it has not been peer reviewed by others in the field at that stage. And that's a key component to kind of verifying the quality of the work that's being done. And then it gets published and other researchers have access to it. And like I said, a lot of times they'll start to build on those findings. And if it's something that might be clinically relevant, a lot of the times clinicians will come together and, synthesize a lot of different research findings into clinical practice. So if there's something that has been found a lot of times across several research studies, experts in that field might come together and issue some type of clinical guidance that would guide how clinicians handle. And that's really, just one example of how stuff can make it out of a research paper into a doctor's office. But there is often still just really a huge gap between how these findings along the way make it into the hands of patients. And I think there's just a real hurdle for engagement there. But I think, I think some scientific conferences and some venues are trying to do a better job of this, of ensuring that there is patient representation on panels or talks about the research being done, trying to pull in patients into the, the actual research process. In some fields, there are patient advocates that are actively engaged with researchers and designing research products. So I don't know. I don't have a solution. It's a huge challenge in terms of getting research from researchers into the hand of the community. I think it takes a concerted effort from nonprofits working on these topics and these issues, and some dedicated researchers and clinicians who are willing to put in the work to digest it, like Larry is. I think those are really, really helpful resources to just be able to take a potentially inaccessible paper and make it something where anyone can stumble upon it online and understand what it might mean.
Thank you. And by the way, just kind of backtracking for a second, as far as the accessibility of reading a paper, someone in the chat or the comments, I don't know what you call it, shared the tip. I copy and paste research into Chat GPT, and it gives a great summary that's easier to understand.
Yeah, what a great idea. Love that. Might as well use these tools to do that. And that's a really great suggestion. I will be using that in future suggestions.
Yeah. Like, read this paper for me and then summarize it in a way that I can understand a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also just want to acknowledge there's a couple of questions we've received in the comments here that I feel bad for ignoring right now, but the only reason that we're not asking them, like one was about genetic markers, if they've been identified, one was about transcranial direct current stimulation. I'm only not addressing them because I think those are good, like standalone topics that I can plan a future webinar around. Today, we're trying to keep it like super high level research 101 kind of focus without talking about specific, genetic markers or biomarkers or treatments that are being studied. So I hope people understand. The question that we had received in registration was, if one study shows a result, is that enough to draw a conclusion? How does that work?
Yeah. So one study on its own can be really informative and transformative, honestly. I mean, I think a lot of big findings in the field start with just one study, right? But I think, going back to something I discussed earlier, the key to moving research forward is really reproducibility and consensus building. So I think in general, if there is a study from a while ago, loosely defined a while ago, like let's say, 5+ years ago, and it's still the only study that has reported that result, that might be cause for skepticism. And that's not to cast doubt on the actual quality of the research in that paper itself. It just means that perhaps the the conclusions drawn in that one study have not been able to be reproduced by others in some fashion. I think the strongest science in general is the ones where you might see one exciting paper at first, and then within the next few years, you see a lot more building on that topic or along the same lines. It's really that concept of consensus building and moving forward off of that makes the strongest case. And again, it's not that one study alone can't be important. It's just that one study in isolation often isn't enough. So it's usually a first step. And if there's never a second or a third step, there might be some questions to be asked about what prevented it from being replicated or why it hasn't been replicated.
Good points. Thank you. All right. A question that we had received, and this actually specifically came from a physical therapist, but I think that this pertains to any healthcare clinician. What are some ways that clinicians can get involved in research for these diseases?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know what type of setting this person practices in, but I think if you're connected with any sort of academic or larger hospital system, I would look into what might already be going on in your own system. There might be ways for you to get involved with projects there and lend your particular expertise to that study or find some additional way to add to the study, right? I think multidisciplinary teams pulling from a lot of different areas of expertise can add a lot of value. So I strongly encourage this person to look into it. But if you're in a setting where there might not be research happening around you, I would, look into what other studies are out there that are working on something of interest to your own work and, just reach out. I think that there's always room to be had for those types of conversations. And even if, you can't help out with a project that already exists, it might give this person some ideas or some next steps in terms of how they could pursue their own project or who else they might want to connect with to get involved. And this is also where, too, I think if this person wants to get involved with research, particularly in these spaces, I encourage them to go to conferences in the field, whether it's movement disorders, the Alzheimer's conference, our conference on PSP and CBD. It's a really productive venue to just have those informal conversations and learn more about what projects are happening and how they can get involved. But that's great. I love that question, and I hope this individual can get involved with the project. It's so important.
And I'll use that as I'm not a plant, I promise. If that person happens to be watching this live, next week is our scientific symposium in London. If you want to join Dr. Brummet and our other staff in London and learn about research that's going on. Okay, well, we're at time. And so I'll just end on sort of a general question of, is there anything else that you want to make sure to share about how people find opportunities to participate in trials or, stay up to date on the kinds of research that's going on?
Yeah. I mean, we at CurePSP try to do our best to communicate new opportunities. So if you're not tapped into our mailing list or network already, I strongly encourage you to do that. In terms of clinical trial updates, I strongly recommend the Michael J. Fox Trial Finder. It's a great resource that does specifically allow users to search on PSP and CBD and MSA. So I encourage everyone to check that out if you haven't already. It's very user-friendly compared to clinicaltrials.gov, which is not always so user-friendly. And, I also just encourage everyone, there's a lot of research advocacy materials out there from very reputable organizations. And I think that they're just really helpful to kind of frame what patients can do and what our community can do and where your input is particularly valuable, because it is valuable. And so I think I just recommend everyone check out NORD, which I already recommended, the National Organization for Rare Diseases, there's a group called PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and they don't work specifically on PSP or CBD or MSA, but they have a lot of really valuable resources that I think would be of interest to our reaching out to us, and we'll do our best to, like I said at the start, and I meant it, I really hope this is part one of teaching our CurePSP community a little bit about research and where we can act as a community. And I do really look forward to a future conversation on this and brainstorming, how we can continue to move forward. So I'll leave it at that. But with one final footnote, which is don't hesitate to reach out if you're on the line and you have questions at any point about this.
Yes, please. And thank you for saying that last bit too, because what I was going to say is there's so much more we could talk about with, any part of this. And so I would love for us to continue that conversation of future webinars to maybe delve deeper into specifics with different kinds of research or the more frequently asked questions that we get. And like she shared, if we did not get to your question today, or you have other questions come up about research or other topics related to PSP, CBD, or MSA, please reach out to us. Our general email box is info@curepsp.org, and we will do our best to get you the right answers and resources from there. Dr. Brummet, thank you. Thank you for everyone who viewed this today and will view it when it's archived, and for sharing your experiences and your questions. Before I let you all go, I want to quickly share that our virtual family conference is coming up on October 31st and November 2nd, and will feature pre-recorded talks and live question and answer with speakers from CurePSP, as well as the Centers of Care at the University of Florida and University of South Florida, on topics like nutritional health and enhancing accessibility and independence in the home, and much more. So definitely encourage you all to partake in that. Our next Ask the Expert webinar will be on December 6th, and that will be on the topic of considerations for hiring professional in-home care. You'll be able to find information on both of those on our website under our events calendar on our main page, so CurePSP or psp.org, and then scroll down to the events calendar. I also want to encourage everyone to check out the CurePSP YouTube channel if you haven't already. There are so many archived webinars and sessions from our family conferences on there. So much good information for you all to tap into. And then lastly, as always, it's important to highlight that we're able to offer these webinars and all of our resources and programs and support the research that we do. And we're always growing and getting better and better for all of you through your support of CurePSP's mission to raise awareness, build community, improve care, and find a cure for PSP, CBD, and MSA. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.